My hands shake as I pack my old camera into a small box. The lens is cracked from when it fell during my photography class last week. I'm 72 years old and my name is Rose Martinez. For 40 years I worked as a school photographer, taking pictures of kids on their first day, graduation ceremonies and sports events. My small apartment in Meadowbrook feels too quiet now that I've been retired for 6 years. The walls are covered with my favorite photos. Children laughing, families hugging, moments of pure joy I captured through my camera. My son Carlos lives across town with his wife Sandra and their twin boys, Miguel and Luis. Carlos used to love looking at my photos when he was young. He would sit on my lap and point at each picture, asking me to tell him the story behind it. Before we continue, first let me thank you for watching Granny's Voice. Please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We might give you a shout out in our next video. Today's special shout out goes to Ervinia Villanueva from Fort Pierce, Florida. Thank you for being part of our family. Now, let me tell you everything. But something changed when Carlos married Sandra 8 years ago. She seemed nice at first, always smiling when they visited. She would compliment my cooking and ask about my photography work. But slowly, I noticed she would roll her eyes when Carlos talked to me for too long. She would check her phone or start cleaning up while I was telling stories. When the twins were born, I was so excited to be a grandmother. I bought them matching baby outfits and took hundreds of pictures during my visits. But Sandra started making rules about when I could visit. The babies need a schedule, she would say. Too many visitors make them cranky. Carlos would nod and agree with everything she said. I watched my cheerful son become quiet and distant. He stopped calling me just to chat. Our visits became shorter and more formal. Sandra would sit between us during dinner, controlling every conversation. If I tried to give Carlos a hug goodbye, she would suddenly remember something urgent they needed to do. I started to feel like a stranger in my own son's life. 3 months ago, my sister Elena passed away suddenly from a stroke. We were not just sisters but best friends who talked every day. Elena had no children of her own, so she left me her house and all her savings. It was a beautiful 2-story home with a big backyard and a garage I could turn into a photography studio. I had always dreamed of teaching photography to young people, and Elena's gift made it possible. The inheritance was enough to fix up the house and buy new camera equipment. I felt excited about life again for the first time in years. I could finally start the photography school I had always wanted. I imagined children and teenagers learning to capture beautiful moments, just like I had done for decades. But when I told Carlos about my plans, he looked worried instead of happy for me. Sandra called me the next morning with her sweet fake voice. "Rose, how are you feeling today?" she asked, but I could tell she wasn't really interested in my answer. "I'm doing well, Sandra, thank you for asking," I replied, trying to stay polite. "That's wonderful to hear. Carlos asked me to check on you about Elena's house. We're just concerned that someone might try to trick you into bad investments. You know how many scammers target older people these days, especially when they get inheritance money." I felt my stomach turn. It had only been 1 day since the funeral, and they were already worried about the money. Elena had been a talented artist who painted landscapes and sold them at local markets. We weren't particularly close when we were young because she traveled a lot for her art. But in recent years we became very close, talking on the phone every evening and visiting each other every weekend. To everyone's surprise, including mine, she left me not only her beautiful house but also a large amount of money she had saved from selling her paintings over the years. "The lawyers are very good at their job, Sandra. I already have all the papers and the money is safely in my bank account," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. There was a pause, and I could almost see her thinking about what to say next. "That's great news, Rose. Carlos will be so relieved. By the way, he wanted me to ask about your plans for the money. He has some really good investment ideas that could help your money grow instead of just sitting there doing nothing." My money. Not Elena's gift, not my inheritance, but my money. As if its only purpose was to make more money for Carlos and Sandra. "Thank you for caring, but I already know exactly what I want to do with this money," I said firmly. "Really? Her voice became colder. What are your plans, if you don't mind me asking? I took a deep breath. I had been thinking about this for weeks. I want to buy Elena's house and turn the garage into a photography studio. I'll teach photography classes to kids and teenagers. Maybe I'll even start a small business taking family portraits. The silence on the phone was so long I thought she had hung up. Rose, she finally said with fake concern, are you sure that's wise at your age? Starting a business is very hard work. And dealing with children all day might be too much for you to handle. What will happen to the business when you get sick or can't work anymore? Wouldn't it be better to invest the money for your grandchildren's future? By grandchildren she meant Miguel and Luis, but really she meant herself and Carlos. After 8 years of marriage, I was still nothing more than a source of money to her. I feel great, Sandra, and I plan to enjoy teaching photography for many years. As for the future, I've already started writing my will to make sure everything is handled properly. I heard her take a sharp breath. Of course, she said quickly, changing her tone. We just worry about you. By the way, we'd like to invite you to dinner this Friday at that new restaurant downtown. We need to talk about family things. Just the adults. The adults. That meant an evening of Sandra making rude comments while Carlos stayed quiet, and them trying to convince me to give up my dreams. But I agreed anyway, knowing I would probably regret it. Okay, Sandra. What time should I be there? 6 o'clock. The restaurant is called Sunset Diner. We've booked a table for 5 people. 5 people? Asked confused. Yes, my cousin Danny and his wife Maria will be there too. They really want to meet you. Great. Witnesses for whatever she was planning. Sandra never invited extra people unless she had a reason. See you Friday, Rose, she said, ending the call. After hanging up, I felt a familiar headache starting. Every conversation with Sandra left me feeling this way. I looked at the clock. It was almost 10 in the morning. I had an appointment at 11 to look at Elena's house with a contractor who would help me turn the garage into a photography studio. As I drove to the house, I saw a young boy fixing his bicycle on the sidewalk. He was completely focused on his work, just like Carlos used to be when he was little. He would spend hours building things with his hands, always so careful and patient. What happened to that curious, kind boy I raised? When did he become a man who let his wife control everything he thought and said? Elena's house was even more beautiful than I remembered. It was a blue 2-story house with white shutters, a front porch with flowers, and a big backyard with fruit trees. The contractor, Mr. Thompson, was already waiting for me. He looked worried as he walked around the garage. Mrs. Martinez, I have to be honest with you. This garage needs a lot of work. New electrical wiring, better lighting, insulation, and floor repairs. It's going to be expensive. I saw possibilities, not problems, Mr. Thompson. High ceilings, lots of space, big windows for natural light. This garage has good bones for a photography studio. The cost of fixing everything might be more than the garage is worth, he warned me. I know that money isn't the most important thing here. This garage is perfect for teaching children about photography and art. Mr. Thompson looked puzzled. Probably not many 72-year-old women wanted to start photography businesses, but I didn't care what he thought. If you're sure about this, I think we can start working on plans next week. On my drive home, I felt excited and nervous at the same time. For the first time in years, I had a project that was completely mine. Something that had nothing to do with being Carlos's mother or Miguel and Luis's grandmother. Something that would make Elena proud and help me share my love of photography with young people. My phone rang while I was stopped at a red light. It was Carlos. Mom, Sandra told me you're thinking about buying Elena's house. Hi, Carlos. Yes, I'm actually planning to buy it and start a photography studio. But why? That project sounds very complicated and expensive for someone your age. You should be relaxing, not starting a business. Your age? I was 72, not 92. It's my money, Carlos, and my decision. Mom, no one is saying it's not your money, but you have to think about your future. And what about Miguel and Luis? They're your grandchildren. I was thinking about my future. A future where I could teach young people about art and photography, where I could create something meaningful that would help my community. Sandra says this is just a silly idea, he continued. She thinks you're trying to prove that you're still young and independent, but it's not safe for you to take on such a big project. There it was. Not his words, but Sandra's words coming out of his mouth, as usual. Tell Sandra I'd be happy to discuss this on Friday at dinner, I said, trying to stay calm. Also, I have to go now. I have a meeting with my insurance agent about the studio. That was a lie, but I needed to end this conversation before I said something I would regret. Okay, Mom. See you Friday. That evening, I sat on my small balcony looking through old photo albums. Here was Carlos at age 5, building a sandcastle at the beach. Here he was at 12, showing off the birdhouse he made in woodworking class. Here was his high school graduation, where he gave a speech about following your dreams and never giving up. I was standing next to him, so proud of his creativity and determination. And here were the wedding photos. Sandra in a fancy white dress, smiling for the camera. Even then, I could see something cold in her eyes, something calculating that I chose to ignore because Carlos looked so happy. My thoughts were interrupted by my doorbell. I was surprised to see Miguel and Luis at my front door. They were both 14 now, tall and serious like their father had been at their age. "Hi, Grandma," Miguel said politely. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't really want to be there. "Mom asked us to bring you this invitation to dinner. She forgot to mention that it's a fancy restaurant with a dress code. Another way to make me feel out of place and underdressed for their social circle. Thank you, boys. Would you like to come in for cookies and milk?" Luis looked at his brother, clearly wanting to say yes, but Miguel shook his head. "We can't stay long. Our driver is waiting, and we have soccer practice." Course. Their schedule was always too busy for spending time with their grandmother. "See you Friday, Grandma," Luis said, and I could hear sadness in his voice. "By the way," Miguel added as they walked toward the car, "Mom told us about Elena's house and your photography idea. Is that really true?" "Yes, I'm planning to start a photography school for young people," I replied, watching their faces carefully. "Mom says it's a waste of money because no one will come to classes," Luis said, clearly repeating Sandra's words. "What do you think, Luis?" asked gently. He looked confused, like no one had ever asked for his opinion before. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I guess if you like taking pictures, it might be fun." "What would you teach at the school?" Miguel asked, and for a moment he sounded like the curious little boy I remembered. "Photography basics, how to tell stories with pictures, nature photography, portrait photography. Maybe even how to develop film in a darkroom." Something like interest flashed in Miguel's eyes, but he quickly hid it. "That sounds expensive," he said, copying his mother's concerned tone. "Maybe," I agreed. "But I have Elena's inheritance money, and I think it's worth spending on something that could help young people learn new skills." "Mom says it's not fair to spend your money on strangers when you have family," Luis said, again repeating Sandra's words. "What do you think is fair, Luis?" asked. He looked confused again, like this was a difficult question. "I don't know. I guess it's your money, so you should decide what to do with it." It was a small victory, but it meant something. "We have to go," Miguel said, looking at his expensive watch. "Mom will be angry if we're late for practice." I watched them get into a black car with tinted windows. My grandsons were so close in terms of blood, but felt like strangers emotionally. What did they really know about me? Did they know I used to write poetry in college? That I loved jazz music from the 1960s? That I could make the world's best chocolate chip cookies using my mother's secret recipe? On Friday, I put on my nicest blue dress, the one I wore to the retirement ceremony at the school where I worked. It was simple and elegant, exactly what the restaurant dress code required. While driving there, I thought about the conversation ahead. Whatever Sandra had planned, I needed to stay calm and stick to my decision. This money was mine, and only I would decide how to use it. Sunset Diner was exactly what I expected. Expensive and pretentious, trying to look like a fancy European restaurant. The hostess led me to a table where Carlos, Sandra, the twins, and another couple were already sitting. "Here's our Rose," Sandra said loudly, getting up to hug me like we were best friends. "We're so glad you could join us. Meet Danny and Maria Rodriguez. Danny works at my law firm and specializes in property law." Property law. Of course, I shook hands with the Rodriguez family, noticing how Maria looked at me like she was studying me. "It's very nice to meet you," I said, taking my seat next to Luis. "Rose used to work as a school photographer," Sandra explained, her voice clearly showing that she thought my job wasn't important. "She's retired now, but she's still very active. Can you imagine? She wants to fix up an old house and turn it into some kind of photography school." "That sounds ambitious," Danny said with a professional smile. "Who's handling the legal paperwork? Property registration, taxes, insurance. Those are pretty complicated matters for someone who's not experienced." "I have a lawyer, Mr. Peterson. He's been helping me with legal matters for many years," I replied. "Peterson?" Danny frowned. "I don't think I know him. Is he from a big law firm?" "He's an independent lawyer," I said, "and very good at his job." "Mom," Carlos interrupted, "maybe you should consider getting help from someone more modern. Danny could recommend someone from his firm who knows about business law." "Here we go." I could see them exchanging looks with Sandra. Everything was going according to her plan. "Thank you, but I'm very happy with Mr. Peterson," I said firmly. The waiter brought menus, and everyone started talking about what to order. I noticed Sandra whispering something to Carlos, and he was nodding. "Grandma," Luis said to me suddenly, "is it true that Elena was a famous artist?" "Yes, sweetie," I smiled, surprised by his interest. "Elena painted beautiful landscapes and sold them in galleries in several different cities. She had a very special style, mixing realistic details with bright colors. And she left you all her paintings," Luis continued. "Most of them, yes. That's why I want to start a gallery as part of the photography school, so people can see her work." "Sounds like a waste of money," Sandra said quickly. "Those paintings could be sold. I read that your sister's work is becoming more valuable now that she's gone." "That's exactly why I'm not going to sell them," I replied. "Their value will only increase over time, and people should be able to enjoy Elena's art." "But you're not thinking about your future," Carlos said. "About leaving something for Miguel and Luis." "I am thinking about the future," I answered calmly. "About cultural education and creating something meaningful in Elena's memory." Sandra leaned toward Carlos and whispered something in his ear again. He listened carefully, and I saw his face change from uncertainty to determination. "Mom," he said, sitting up straighter, "we're here tonight to have a serious talk about your future, your health and safety. Sandra and I have been talking, and we think you should consider moving to Golden Years Retirement Community. It's a very nice place with medical care, activities, and people your own age. Sandra and I have already talked to them, and they have a room available for you." I stared at him, not believing what I was hearing. "A nursing home? Me? Carlos, I am completely healthy and independent. Why would I need to live in a retirement home?" "It's for your own good," Sandra said quickly. "We're worried about you living alone with no one to check on you. And this idea about starting a photography business, it's too complicated for someone your age." "My age doesn't stop me from being creative and independent," I said, feeling anger building inside me. "And I don't need anyone to check on me." "But the inheritance money," Carlos began. Here we were, getting to the real point. "You're not concerned about my health," I interrupted. "You're concerned about Elena's money." Sandra gave me a cold look. "Rose, that's not fair. We do care about you. We just want to make sure the money is used wisely." "Wisely according to your definition," I said. "In other words, give it to you." Carlos looked embarrassed, but Sandra stayed calm. "You can't deny that we're your family, Rose. And it's natural for us to think about Miguel and Luis's future." "I am thinking about my grandson's future," I said, looking at Miguel and Luis, who were clearly uncomfortable with this conversation. That's exactly why I want to create something educational and meaningful that will last long after I'm gone. A photography school that will serve the community and maybe inspire young people like them. Sandra leaned toward Carlos again and whispered something in his ear. I saw his face turn red and his eyes become angry. Whatever she said had really upset him. Rose, Danny interrupted, clearly trying to reduce the tension. Maybe there's a compromise here. Part of the money for your project, part for a trust fund for the grandchildren. I could help with the legal paperwork. But I wasn't listening to him. I was watching Carlos, who was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. A mixture of anger and something that looked almost like hatred. I didn't know what Sandra had whispered to him, but it had triggered something very deep and painful. We'll talk about this more after dinner, Sandra said, noticing the waiter approaching with our food. For now, let's enjoy our meal. But even though she seemed calm, I could see a satisfied look in her eyes. She was planning something, and judging by Carlos's angry face, it wasn't going to be good for me. I stared at the fancy food on my plate. Grilled salmon with vegetables arranged like a work of art. In a different situation, I might have appreciated the chef's skill, but now I couldn't eat anything. My stomach was too upset. Danny was talking about his recent trip to Europe, and Sandra was listening politely, making intelligent comments. Carlos silently drank his wine, glancing at me from time to time. Miguel and Luis were texting on their phones. Rose, Sandra suddenly said to me, interrupting Danny's story about visiting art museums in Paris. We should congratulate you properly on your inheritance. It's really wonderful that Elena thought of you in her will. Her words had a hidden meaning, that I didn't deserve the inheritance, that Elena and I weren't really close. Elena and I cared about each other very much, I replied calmly. Even though we lived different lives, we understood each other. Of course, Sandra nodded. She lived such an exciting life, traveling, painting, living alone. And you devoted yourself to your career and raising Carlos. Such different choices in life. I could hear the comparison that didn't favor me. In her version, Elena's life seemed exciting and full, while mine seemed boring and limited. Everyone makes their own choices and finds meaning in them, I said. Of course, Sandra agreed quickly. And now, thanks to Elena's generosity, you have the opportunity to try something new. You could travel, or buy a nicer apartment, or invest the money to create steady income for your retirement. I could help you choose good investments, Carlos added, joining the conversation. I've already decided what to do with the inheritance, I reminded them. The photography school is something I've been dreaming about for a long time. A long time. Sandra raised her perfectly shaped eyebrow. But Elena only died 3 months ago. The idea of teaching photography came to me years ago, I explained. Elena's inheritance just made it possible. I see, Sandra nodded with fake understanding. The desire to leave some kind of mark on the world. At your age, that's natural. Again, the emphasis on my age, as if 7'2" was ancient. It's not just about leaving a legacy, I said. Meadowbrook needs a place like this. There's no good art school here. No place for young people to learn creative skills. I doubt young people today are interested in old-fashioned photography, Carlos said with a slight smile. They all have cameras on their phones. You were interested in photography when you were in high school, I reminded him. You even won a contest with that picture of the sunset you took at the beach. I saw Sandra look quickly at Carlos, and he blushed slightly. That was a long time ago, he said dismissively. Different times, different interests. Art never goes out of style, I said. Human creativity and the desire to capture beautiful moments stay the same through all generations. That sounds like a lecture, Sandra smiled, but her eyes stayed cold. But let's talk about practical things. Fixing up an old house costs a lot of money. Are you sure you have enough? I've done all the calculations, I replied. Elena's inheritance is quite substantial. But still, she insisted, maybe it's worth considering other options. For example, renting a smaller space, or working with existing organizations instead of starting from scratch. Elena's house is perfect for my idea, I said firmly. It has the right size, good lighting, and a big backyard where I can teach outdoor photography. Emotions, Sandra sighed, as if that was a disease. But a business plan requires logical thinking. Have you calculated return on investment, monthly expenses, potential income? A photography school isn't meant to be a money-making business, I explained. It's meant to contribute to the community and help young people. So you plan to spend your entire inheritance without making any money back? Sandra looked almost shocked. That doesn't seem like a wise financial decision. There will be returns, I argued. Just not in money. Educational value, artistic inspiration, opportunities for young people to develop their talents. That sounds great in theory, Carlos said. But in practice, projects like this often require ongoing investment. Building maintenance, equipment costs, insurance. In a few years, you might find that you've spent all your money and the business still needs more. I have a plan to get grants and donations from local businesses, I said. I'm not as naive as you think. No one thinks you're naive, Rose, Sandra said quickly. We're just concerned. A project like this is a huge responsibility at any age, and at yours. At my perfectly healthy 72 years old, I finished for her. For a moment, there was awkward silence at the table. Miguel and Luis looked up from their phones, clearly interested in the tension they could feel. Of course, Rose, Maria said diplomatically. No one doubts your energy. You look wonderful for your age. For your age. Another phrase I was starting to hate. Thank you, I replied dryly. The waiter brought our main courses, and for a while we talked about the chef's cooking skills. I noticed Sandra whispering something to Carlos again, and he was nodding, looking at me strangely. Mom, he said when the waiter left, Sandra and I wanted to discuss another option with you. Maybe one that would work better for everyone. I'm listening, I said, though inside I was preparing for another attempt at manipulation. What if we split Elena's inheritance, he suggested. Half for your photography project, and half invested in Miguel and Luis's college funds. We could make it 50-50ths. That's not a compromise, Carlos. I shook my head. That's an attempt to control money that Elena left to me. My sister wanted me to decide how to use it, and I intend to honor her wishes. But you're not thinking about the boys' futures, he insisted, his voice getting louder. What will happen to them when they need money for college or their careers? I've already provided for their education through the trust fund I set up years ago. The rest is your responsibility as their father. That's selfish, Sandra said, her tone becoming harsh. Spending a fortune on a project that will probably fail instead of securing your grandson's financial future. Selfish. I felt my voice rising and made an effort to speak quietly. It's selfish to demand money that doesn't belong to you. It's selfish to expect me to give up my dreams for your financial plans. It's selfish to act like I'm too old and stupid to make my own decisions. Sandra's face became hard, but she quickly regained control and smiled, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. Rose, you're misunderstanding us completely. We just care about you and want what's best for the family. No, Sandra, I said, looking directly at her. You care about Elena's money. And you know what? This conversation is pointless. I've made my decision, and no amount of manipulation will change it. I saw anger flash across Sandra's face, quickly replaced by cold calculation. She turned to Carlos and whispered something in his ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see her lips moving quickly and her eyes never leaving my face. Carlos's expression changed dramatically. His cheeks turned red, his eyes narrowed, and his hands clenched into fists. Whatever Sandra had said to him had hit a nerve and made him furious. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of anger, hurt, and something dangerous. Mom, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. You always do this. You always act like you know better than everyone else. Like we're not smart enough or responsible enough to handle money. But you know what? You're no better than us. Your precious photography school is just your way of trying to prove that you still matter. It's a pathetic attempt to feel important. I was shocked by the cruelty of his words. Carlos, I never said you weren't capable. I never thought that. You never said it, but you always showed it. His voice got louder, making people at nearby tables look at us. You always acted like I was disappointing you. Like I should have been more artistic, more creative, more like Elena. That's not true, I said, trying to touch his hand, but he pulled it away. I've always been proud of you, Carlos. You're a good father and a hard worker. You're lying, he hissed. Even now you're lying. You think I'm boring compared to Elena. You think my life is meaningless compared to her art and travels. You don't think I deserve Elena's money because I'm not creative enough, not special enough. I was stunned. Had he really thought all these years that I compared him to Elena? That I was disappointed in the man he became? Carlos, that's completely wrong. I love you exactly as you are. I always have. Stop lying, he shouted, making the entire restaurant go quiet. You love Elena more than me, even now that she's dead. You'd rather spend her money on strangers than help your own son and grandchildren. Sandra watched us with barely hidden satisfaction. The Rodriguez family looked embarrassed but didn't try to interrupt. Miguel and Luis sat frozen with shock and fear in their eyes. I'm telling you the truth, I said quietly, trying to calm him down. You're my son, and I love you more than anything in the world. Then prove it, he said, leaning across the table toward me. Give up this stupid photography school and invest the money in our family's future. I looked at him for a long time, seeing the pain and anger in his eyes. Part of me wanted to give in, to agree to anything that would make him happy again. But I also saw Sandra's cold eyes watching me, calculating, waiting for me to surrender to their emotional manipulation. I love you, Carlos, I said softly. But I won't let you talk to me this way. And I won't let Sandra control my decisions through you. Sandra leaned toward Carlos one more time and whispered something urgent in his ear. I saw his face change from anger to rage. His eyes becoming wild and unfocused. Whatever she had said was like throwing gasoline on a fire. You, he began, his voice trembling with fury. You selfish, controlling old woman. And then it happened so fast I couldn't react. Carlos stood up from his chair. His hand flew toward me, and I felt a sharp pain explode across my cheek. The force of the slap knocked me sideways, and I fell from my chair onto the hard restaurant floor. The world seemed to stop for a moment. I lay on the floor, stunned by pain and shock. Stars flashed before my eyes, and I could taste blood in my mouth. An instant of complete silence fell over the restaurant, followed by an explosion of voices. Someone screamed. Someone called for the manager. I heard Luis crying with fear. Slowly, I raised my head and saw Sandra's face. She didn't look shocked or horrified. Instead, I saw cold satisfaction in her eyes, quickly replaced by fake concern when she noticed other customers watching. Carlos stood frozen, his hand still raised from hitting me. His face showed a mixture of emotions, shock, horror, and the gradual realization of what he had just done. Grandma! Luis rushed toward me, his face white with terror. Mom! Carlos whispered, as if he was just now understanding what had happened. I didn't mean to. I don't know what came over me. I looked at my son, the man I had raised with love and sacrifice, who had just hit his own mother in public. And in that moment something inside me died. Not love, that would always remain, but the illusion that our relationship could be saved. The taxi stopped in front of my apartment building. I sat in the back seat, unable to move. My whole body felt like it was made of lead. The driver cleared his throat politely. "We're here, ma'am." His voice seemed to come from far away. I mechanically took out my wallet, paid the fare, and got out of the car. My keys slipped from my shaking fingers 3 times before I managed to unlock my front door. I walked into my dark apartment and collapsed into my favorite chair without turning on the lights. The silence felt heavy and oppressive, making what had happened seem even more unreal. Had my son, my Carlos, really hit me? Had I really been lying on a restaurant floor while strangers stared at me with pity and shock? My hand went to my cheek, which was still throbbing with pain. Tomorrow there would be a bruise, maybe even swelling. How would I explain this to my neighbors, my friends from the photography club? What would I say when people asked what happened? Exhaustion washed over me like a wave, and I closed my eyes. In the darkness, images floated before me. Carlos's face twisted with anger. Sandra's cold, satisfied eyes. My grandson's frightened expressions. And somewhere behind all of that, a memory of my late husband Robert, who had never raised his voice to me, let alone his hand. Robert and I had met at a community center dance when we were both 25. He was learning to be a carpenter, and I was working at my first job as a photographer's assistant. We bonded over our love of old movies and Sunday walks in the park. I remembered how he would hold my hand while we walked, talking about our dreams and plans for the future. Our wedding was small and simple, just 30 guests in my family's backyard. Robert insisted that we write our own vows. His words still echoed in my memory. "Rose, you are my best friend and my inspiration. I promise to support your dreams, respect your independence, and love you through good times and bad, until death separates us." We were happy even when money was tight, even when we had to work extra jobs to pay rent. Every Saturday was our adventure day. We would explore new places, take pictures, and discover small towns around our area. Robert would build me custom photo frames for my favorite pictures, and I would document all our adventures together. When Carlos was born, our life became even more wonderful. We took him everywhere with us, to art fairs, photography exhibits, nature walks, and community events. Robert built wooden toys for him, and I taught him how to use my old cameras, showing him different ways to see the world through a lens. Carlos grew up to be a curious, creative boy with a gentle heart and an eye for beauty. He loved taking pictures of insects, clouds, and his father's woodworking projects. Then that terrible day came when Carlos was 15. Robert was working on a construction site when the scaffolding collapsed. The call from the hospital came like lightning from a clear sky. A severe head injury. The doctors did everything they could, but it was too late. Carlos stood next to me at the funeral, tall and skinny, his face like stone. He didn't cry during the service, didn't show any emotion. Only later that night did I hear quiet sobbing coming from his room. I wanted to go comfort him, but when I knocked on his door, he told me to go away. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He got ready for school, ate breakfast, and left without talking about his feelings. From that day forward, something changed between us. It was like an invisible wall had grown between Carlos and me. I tried to break through it by suggesting photo walks together or offering to help him with his school photography projects, but Carlos increasingly said no, preferring to spend time with friends or alone in his room. I threw myself into work. I got promoted to head photographer at the school district, started freelancing for local newspapers, and began saving every penny for Carlos's college education. I was determined to give him all the opportunities that Robert and I had dreamed of providing. He got into a good state university, studied business management, and found a steady job at a marketing company. I was proud of his success, though I noticed that each year he became less like the sensitive, artistic boy Robert and I had raised. He became more focused on making money, less interested in creativity and beauty. And then he met Sandra. She was a legal assistant at a law firm that worked with his company. Ambitious, confident, perfectly dressed, and coldly beautiful. When Carlos brought Sandra to meet me, I felt immediate discomfort. There was something calculating in her smile, something false in her laugh. But Carlos looked at her with such adoration that I pushed my doubts aside. Their wedding was expensive and showy. Over 150 guests, a fancy hotel ballroom, and a menu that cost more than I made in 3 months. I felt out of place among Sandra's sophisticated friends and family. During the ceremony, as they exchanged standard vows from a wedding book, I couldn't help remembering the heartfelt, personal words Robert and I had shared. After the marriage, Carlos became even more distant. Our visits became formal dinners on holidays where Sandra controlled every conversation and Carlos nodded along with whatever she said. I watched her gradually separate him from his old friends, his hobbies, and anything that didn't fit her idea of success. When Miguel and Luis were born, first Miguel, then Luis 2 minutes later, I hoped it would bring us closer. I offered to babysit, wanted to teach them photography, and hoped to share with them the creativity and wonder that I had once shared with Carlos. But Sandra always had reasons to limit my time with the twins. They're too young for cameras. They need structured activities. We have other plans. I set up college funds for both boys, contributing money every month to ensure their education would be paid for. Sandra accepted this with cold gratitude, as if it were something she deserved rather than a generous gift. Carlos never even tried to argue when she gradually pushed me out of their family life. And now this, a slap across the face, a physical expression of years of emotional distance and resentment that I had tried to ignore for the sake of keeping some connection with my son. The doorbell interrupted my painful memories. I didn't move from my chair, hoping whoever it was would give up and leave. But the bell rang again, more insistently. "Rose, I know you're home. Please open the door." I recognized the voice immediately. Janet Williams, my former colleague from the school district and my closest friend for the past 20 years. We had worked together in the photography department and stayed in touch after I retired. Even during my loneliest moments after Robert's death, Janet had been there with practical help and emotional support. I struggled to get up from my chair, feeling every muscle in my body ache with exhaustion and stress. I walked slowly to the front door, trying to think of an explanation for the bruise that was probably already forming on my cheek. But when I opened the door and saw Janet's concerned face, all my planned excuses disappeared. "My God, Rose," she gasped, staring at my swollen cheek. "What happened to you?" "It's nothing serious," I tried to brush it off. "I just had a little accident." "Don't lie to me," she said firmly, pushing past me into the apartment. "I've known you for 20 years. That's not from an accident. Someone hit you." She turned on the lights in the living room, and I winced at the sudden brightness. Janet stared at my face with growing horror and anger. "Who did this to you?" she demanded. "And don't tell me no one. I can see the finger marks." I sank back into my chair, suddenly feeling that I couldn't keep all of this inside anymore. "Carlos," I said quietly. "My son hit me tonight during dinner at a restaurant." Janet's eyes widened in shock. "Carlos? But why? What could have possibly happened?" And then I told her everything. About Elena's inheritance, about my plans for the photography school, about Sandra's manipulation, about how she had whispered something to Carlos that made him lose control completely. Janet listened without interrupting, only shaking her head occasionally in disbelief. When I finished, she went to my kitchen and came back with a bag of frozen peas wrapped in a dish towel. "Put this on your cheek," she instructed. "It will help with the swelling." She pressed the cold compress against my face, and the icy touch was both painful and soothing. "Hold this here for 15 minutes, she said. "Now let's talk about what you're going to do next." "Do?" "Yes." "What do you mean?" "I mean your son committed assault, Rose," she said bluntly. "That's a crime. You could file charges against him." I shook my head quickly. "No, Janet. I'm not going to do that." "Why not?" "Because he's your son. That's no excuse for violence." "I know," I sighed. "It's just the police, the legal system, all the publicity. I don't want to go through that. And I don't want to put Miguel and Luis through it either." Janet studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand your feelings, but you have to do something. You can't just pretend this never happened." "I'm not going to pretend," I said, and there was a strength in my voice that surprised even me. "I'm cutting all ties with Carlos and Sandra completely." "Are you serious?" Janet looked surprised. "Are you sure about that?" "Absolutely sure. I've been making excuses for Carlos's behavior for too many years. I kept telling myself that he was just under Sandra's influence, that he was still the loving son I remembered from his childhood. But tonight he made a choice. He chose to hit his own mother, and there have to be consequences for that choice. Janet nodded slowly, and I saw respect growing in her eyes. I'm proud of you for saying that, Rose. It's about time you stood up for yourself. It won't be easy, I admitted. Carlos and the boys are my only family left. No, Janet said firmly. Family isn't just about blood relationships. Family is people who love and respect you, who support your dreams instead of trying to control them, who celebrate your successes instead of trying to tear you down. Her words hit me deeply. How many years had I clung to the idea of family while ignoring the fact that I hadn't had a real family relationship in a long time? Ever since Sandra had entered Carlos's life, she had systematically destroyed our connection, turning my son into her puppet and me into an obstacle to her complete control. You're absolutely right, I said, lowering the ice pack. But what about Miguel and Luis? You can try to maintain separate relationships with them, Janet suggested. They're old enough to understand what's happening, especially after witnessing tonight's scene. I remembered Luis's face when he ran to help me after I fell. The shock, the fear, the confusion, and something else I couldn't identify at the time. Maybe understanding. Maybe the realization that something fundamentally wrong had just happened. Maybe you're right, I agreed. But Sandra will do everything she can to prevent that from happening. You're underestimating yourself, Rose, Janet said with a gentle smile. You've always been a strong woman. Remember how you fought to get the school district to buy better photography equipment? How you stood up to that difficult principal who tried to cut your program? How you managed to raise Carlos alone while building a successful career? I smiled slightly, remembering those battles. Yes, I had been strong once. That strength is still inside you, Janet continued, as if reading my thoughts. You just let Carlos and Sandra convince you that you were weak and dependent, that you needed their approval and guidance. But you don't. You're probably right, I sighed. I was so afraid of losing my relationship with Carlos that I was willing to accept any treatment just to stay connected to him. But tonight something broke inside me. Something that can't be fixed. And that's a good thing, Janet said firmly. Sometimes you have to tear down a damaged structure before you can build something better and healthier. She got up and went to my kitchen. I heard her making tea, the familiar sounds of cups clinking and water boiling. A few minutes later, she returned with 2 steaming mugs. Here, she said, handing me one. Chamomile with honey. It will help you relax. I took the warm cup, feeling the heat spread through my cold fingers. Thank you, Janet, for everything. For coming here, for listening, for caring. That's what friends do, she said, waving away my thanks. By the way, how did you know I was home? Did something happen? Janet sipped her tea and looked at me over the rim of her cup. Maria Rodriguez called me. We go to the same book club at the library. She was very upset about what happened at the restaurant. She said Carlos hit you and you left alone. I was worried, so I decided to check on you. Oh, Maria, I nodded. She looked horrified, just like everyone else there. Everyone except Sandra. What do you mean? Janet frowned. Sandra didn't look surprised or upset. She looked satisfied, like everything had gone exactly according to her plan. Do you think she deliberately provoked Carlos? I'm certain she did, I said firmly. She whispered something in his ear right before he exploded. Something that made him furious. Something very personal and hurtful. But what could she have said that would cause such a reaction? I shook my head. I don't know. Something about Elena, maybe. Or about Robert. Carlos was shouting about me loving them more than him. About always being disappointed in him. That's ridiculous, Janet said. You always talked about Carlos with such pride and love. I know, I sighed. But apparently he felt differently. Or maybe Sandra convinced him to feel that way over the years of their marriage. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking our tea. Outside, it was completely dark except for the streetlights casting yellow circles on the empty sidewalks. "What are you going to do about the photography school?" Janet asked eventually. "I'm going to continue with the project," I replied without hesitation. "Tomorrow I have a meeting with the contractor to finalize the renovation plans for Elena's garage. Then I need to order camera equipment and start planning the curriculum." "That sounds wonderful," Janet smiled. "I always said Meadowbrook needed a good place for young people to learn about art and photography. Have you thought about which of Elena's paintings you'll display?" "Most of her nature series. The landscapes she painted around the lake, the flower gardens, the sunset scenes. They're very colorful and inspiring. Perfect for encouraging creativity in young students." "What about classes? Will you teach different age groups?" We spent the next hour discussing the details of my project, and I felt the excitement that had been dampened by the conflict with Carlos slowly returning. Talking about the photography school, its possibilities, what it could offer to the community, made me feel alive and purposeful again. When Janet finally got ready to leave, it was almost midnight. She insisted that I continue using ice on my cheek and promised to call me the next day. "You're going to be fine, Rose," she said, hugging me goodbye. "You're stronger than you realize, and you deserve respect from your son, from your daughter-in-law, from everyone. Real love doesn't require you to accept humiliation and abuse, even from family members." After she left, I stood at my window for a long time, looking out at Meadowbrook at night. The town lights reflected off the small lake in the distance, creating patterns that reminded me of Elena's paintings. Robert used to love this view. He said it made him feel connected to something larger than himself, to the beauty and continuity of life. "What would you do, Robert?" asked myself. "What would you do in my situation?" I could almost hear his voice, calm and steady. "You already know the answer, Rose. You've always known." And it was true. Deep in my heart, I knew what I had to do. End the toxic relationships that had been poisoning my life for years. Focus on the photography project that would honor Elena's memory and help young people in my community. Try to maintain a connection with Miguel and Luis if they wanted it, but accept that it might not be possible while they lived under Sandra's control. And start a new chapter of my life. One without manipulation, without humiliation, without the constant fear of losing something that had already been lost long ago. My cheeks still throbbed with pain, reminding me of what had happened. But strangely, this physical pain brought a kind of clarity. It was as if Carlos's slap had broken not just my skin, but also the illusions I had been holding onto for so many years. Illusions about family, about my son, about my role in their lives. I went to my bedroom and slowly got ready for sleep. Tomorrow would be a new day. A day when I would begin living a different kind of life with new goals, new understanding of myself and my relationships. And for the first time in many years, I felt not fear about the future, but an unexpected sense of relief. It was as if a heavy weight I had been carrying for years had finally been lifted from my shoulders, allowing me to stand straight and breathe freely again. The morning sun streamed through my bedroom windows as I made myself breakfast. A week had passed since that horrible night at the restaurant. The bruise on my cheek had faded to a yellowish color, but it was still visible. I had stopped trying to hide it with makeup. People see it. Let them ask questions. I wasn't going to keep secrets anymore just to protect Carlos and Sandra's reputation. My phone had been ringing constantly. Carlos trying to call me, text messages from Sandra, even voicemails from Miguel asking if I was okay. I hadn't answered any of them. I wasn't ready to hear Carlos's voice, his excuses, his attempts to blame his behavior on stress or alcohol. Maybe I would never be ready. Instead, I focused on preparing for today's meeting with Mr. Peterson, my longtime lawyer. He was a quiet, elderly man with a sharp mind and an excellent reputation. He had helped me with legal matters since Robert's death, assisted with setting up the twins' college funds, and would now be helping me change my will. The documents I had prepared were sitting on my kitchen table in a neat folder. Today was important, and no amount of guilt or sentimental manipulation would make me change my course. Mr. Peterson's office was in a historic building in downtown Meadowbrook. The secretary, who had known me for years, smiled warmly and immediately showed me into his office. "Mrs. Martinez." Mr. Peterson stood up to greet me. "I'm glad to see you, although I wish the circumstances were more pleasant." I had briefly explained the situation when I called to make the appointment, but now, sitting in his comfortable office, I told him everything in detail. About Elena's inheritance, the conflict with Carlos and Sandra, and the physical assault. "This is a very serious matter, Mrs. Martinez," Mr. Peterson said when I finished. "You could press charges for assault." "No," I shook my head. "I don't want to go to court. I just want to change my will and make sure Elena's inheritance is used as I intend." He nodded understandingly. "In that case, we'll need to prepare new documents. Your current will, if I remember correctly, leaves everything to Carlos with provisions for the grandchildren's education." "Yes," I confirmed. "Now I want the photography school to be the main beneficiary. Elena's house, her art collection, the equipment I'm buying. Everything should go to a foundation that will run the school." Mr. Peterson made careful notes in his legal pad. "What about your personal belongings and savings?" I paused for a moment thinking. "Personal items that aren't related to the school can go to Miguel and Luis when they turn 18. As for my savings," I hesitated. "Half should go to the foundation to support the school's operations. A quarter should go to additional scholarship funds for the boys if they want to attend college or art school. And a quarter should go to Janet Williams, my closest friend." "No direct inheritance for your son?" Mr. Peterson asked. "None," I replied firmly. "Carlos has already received enough from me. His education, emotional support, financial help when he needed it. Now he needs to take care of himself." Mr. Peterson looked at me seriously over his glasses. "You do realize he might contest the will? As your only child. He has legal grounds to challenge it." "I know," I nodded. "But he won't have much success. I'm mentally competent and capable of making my own decisions. Plus, there are witnesses to what happened at the restaurant. If it goes to court, the publicity won't be good for his career or Sandra's reputation." "That's true," Mr. Peterson agreed. "I'll have the documents ready by the end of next week. You'll need to sign them in front of 2 witnesses who aren't beneficiaries of the will." "I'll ask Janet and one of my former colleagues from the school," I said. "One more thing," he added. "You should consider naming a healthcare proxy in case you become unable to make medical decisions for yourself. It's a sensible precaution at any age." The suggestion made me think about getting older, about the inevitable realities of aging. I would have chosen Carlos before, but now, "Janet," I said firmly. "She knows me better than anyone, and I trust her judgment completely." Mr. Peterson nodded and made another note. "What about Elena's house? You mentioned you wanted to speed up the purchase process." "Yes," I confirmed. "The current owner is willing to close quickly if we don't negotiate on price. I can pay cash from Elena's inheritance. I can contact the seller's lawyer and expedite the paperwork," Mr. Peterson offered. "I also recommend getting a thorough inspection of the building, given its age and the renovations you're planning." "I've already scheduled that for Monday," I smiled. "The inspector will check the electrical system, plumbing, foundation, and roof." "Excellent," Mr. Peterson smiled back. "It's refreshing to see you taking such a comprehensive approach to this project." When I left his office 2 hours later, I felt lighter somehow. Taking concrete legal steps gave my decision weight and permanence, which I found surprisingly comforting. In my car I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Carlos, 1 text message from Sandra, and 1 message from Luis that made my heart skip. "Grandma, are you okay? I'm worried about you. Please let me know." His concern touched me deeply. I quickly typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Very busy with some projects. We'll talk soon." I didn't read Sandra's message, knowing it would be a mixture of fake concern and veiled threats. Instead, I drove to my next appointment, the bank, where I was opening a separate account for Elena's inheritance and my savings. The bank manager, a professional young woman, didn't ask unnecessary questions, though I noticed her gaze lingering on my still visible bruise. After leaving the bank, I felt hungry and decided to have lunch at Rosie's Cafe, a small restaurant near the lake where Robert and I used to go on weekend mornings. We would sit by the window, share a newspaper, and watch joggers and dog walkers pass by on the lakeside path. After Robert's death, I had avoided this place because the memories were too painful. But today something drew me there. I ordered a turkey sandwich and iced tea, enjoying the familiar view of the lake sparkling in the afternoon sunshine. The peaceful scene reminded me why I loved Meadowbrook, why I wanted to contribute something meaningful to this community. Lost in my thoughts, I didn't immediately notice someone approaching my table. I looked up to see Sandra standing beside me, perfectly dressed as always, with her hair styled and her makeup flawless. But I could see tension around her eyes. "Rose," she said, sitting down across from me without being invited. "I've been looking for you everywhere." "Sandra," I replied, unable to hide my surprise. "How did you know I was here?" "Meadowbrook is a small town," she shrugged. "Janet Williams mentioned to someone at the library that she saw you driving toward the Lake District." I made a mental note to be more careful about my movements. The town really was small, and word traveled fast. "What do you want, Sandra?" I asked directly. "To talk," she replied, maintaining her fake smile. "Carlos is devastated about what happened. He hasn't slept in a week. He's never done anything like that before. He's not a violent person, Rose." Something just snapped in that moment. "He feels terrible about it. Terrible enough to come here himself." I asked sarcastically. "He's afraid you won't want to see him," Sandra explained. "And honestly, I was worried about that too. But we have to resolve this situation somehow. For the sake of the family, if not for ourselves." "The situation has already been resolved, Sandra," I said calmly. "I'm ending my relationship with you and Carlos permanently." Her eyes widened slightly. She clearly hadn't expected such a direct response. "But that's impossible, Rose. We're family." "No," I shook my head. "Family members love and respect each other. 4 years you've manipulated Carlos, turned him against me, tried to control my decisions and my money. And now he's physically attacked me. This isn't a family. It's a toxic relationship that I refuse to continue." Sandra's facade began to crack, and I saw cold anger replacing her fake concern. "Rose, I think you're overreacting. Yes, what Carlos did was wrong, but such drastic decisions. This is an emotional response that you might regret later." "I've thought this through very carefully," I replied. "I've already taken concrete steps. My will has been changed. Carlos has been completely disinherited. Elena's money has been moved to accounts he can't access. The house purchase will be finalized within days." I watched her expression change from fake concern to barely concealed fury. "You can't do this," she said, her voice hardening. "Carlos is your only child, your legal heir. He can contest the will in court." "Let him try," I shrugged. "He has very little chance of winning, especially given the circumstances. And a public trial where his assault on me becomes public knowledge is unlikely to help his career or your social standing." Sandra pressed her lips together in a thin line. "You don't understand what you're doing. This decision will hurt not just us, but Miguel and Luis too." "The boys have nothing to do with our conflict," I said firmly. "I've already provided for their education, and my new will includes additional funds for them. They'll receive money directly, without your control." "You have no right to interfere in how we raise our children," Sandra hissed, forgetting her role as the concerned daughter-in-law. "I'm not interfering," I replied calmly. "I'm just securing their future and leaving the door open for them to have a relationship with me if they choose to, when they're old enough to make their own decisions." Sandra stared at me with unconcealed hatred, then leaned forward and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Do you want to know what I told Carlos that night? I told him that you always thought he was a failure compared to Elena. That you told me how disappointed you were that he didn't become an artist like his aunt. That you said Elena's money was your way of creating an artistic legacy worthy of your family name, not Carlos's ordinary life. I recoiled, shocked by her cruelty. That's a complete lie. I never said any of those things. Does it matter? Sandra smiled coldly. He believed it. And he'll always believe that his mother thought he wasn't good enough, wasn't creative enough, wasn't worthy of love. With that, she stood up and walked away, leaving me shaken by her admission of deliberate manipulation. Now I knew exactly what she had whispered to Carlos that night, and why he had reacted so violently. She had used his deepest insecurities and fears against him, and against me. It confirmed that ending this relationship was the only right decision. These people would never change, never stop trying to control and manipulate others for their own benefit. I sat in the cafe for another hour, trying to process Sandra's cruel revelation. Then I drove home, determined to finish what I had started. I spent the evening writing letters to Miguel and Luis by hand. In this age of email and text messages, handwritten letters seemed more personal and meaningful. My letter to Miguel was careful but sincere. I explained my decision to cut ties with their parents, expressed hope that someday we could rebuild our relationship, and told him that I would always love him regardless of what happened. The letter to Luis was more emotional. I sensed that he was more like me. Sensitive, thoughtful, with a deep inner world that he was forced to hide under Sandra's influence. I wrote about creativity, about following your dreams even when others don't understand, about the importance of staying true to yourself. I explained to both boys that my decision to end contact with their parents had nothing to do with my feelings for them, that my door would always be open when they were ready, and that I hoped someday to show them Elena's paintings and share stories about our family's history that their parents had tried to erase. After sealing the envelopes, I put them in my desk drawer. I would send them later when things had calmed down. Right now, it would only create more anger and conflict. In the evening, Carlos called again. This time I stared at the phone for a long time, fighting the urge to answer, to hear his voice, maybe even to believe his apologies. But I remembered Sandra's words, her admission of the lies she had whispered to him, and decided that talking was pointless. As long as Carlos remained under Sandra's influence, no real reconciliation was possible. Instead, I called Janet and told her about my encounter with Sandra. "What a manipulative witch!" Janet exclaimed, using Carlos's insecurities about his father and Elena to turn him against you. "That's just evil. But effective," I sighed. She knew exactly what buttons to push to make him lose control. "What now?" Janet asked. "Now I'm moving forward with my life," I replied with determination. "I'm finalizing the house purchase, starting the renovations, and preparing to open the photography school. I'm living my life without waiting for their approval or permission." "That sounds like an excellent plan," Janet said approvingly. "And you know what? I'm proud of you, Rose. It takes real strength to break away from a toxic family relationship, especially when it involves your only child." "It's not easy," I admitted. "Part of me still hopes Carlos will come to his senses, that he'll realize what Sandra has done to our relationship." "He's a grown man," Janet reminded me gently. "He's responsible for his own choices, regardless of his wife's influence. He chose to believe her lies and he chose to hit you. He has to live with the consequences of those choices." I knew she was right, but a mother's heart doesn't easily accept logical arguments. Part of me would always love Carlos, would always remember the sweet, creative boy with bright eyes and a gentle heart. But I had to accept that that boy had grown into a man I barely recognized. The next few days passed quickly, filled with business meetings and planning sessions. I signed the final papers to buy Elena's house, met with the contractor who would renovate the garage, and discussed curriculum ideas with a retired art teacher who wanted to help with the school. Every decision, every step forward gave me confidence and confirmed that I was on the right path. Carlos continued calling but less frequently. One afternoon, I noticed his car parked across the street from my apartment, but I stayed inside until he left. I wasn't ready for that confrontation, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. Instead, I immersed myself completely in the photography school project. I sorted through Elena's paintings, researched the history of the house that would soon be mine, and planned educational programs for different age groups. This work filled my time and energy, leaving no room for regret or second-guessing. And strangely, the more I invested in this project, the less I defined myself through my relationships with others. Every day, I rediscovered Rose Martinez. Not just Carlos's mother or the twins' grandmother, but a woman with her own dreams, talents, and goals. A woman who could create something meaningful, not just for her family, but for an entire community. One evening, while looking through old photo albums, I found a picture taken just before Robert's death. We were standing by the lake, the wind blowing our hair, the sun making us squint, but we were smiling naturally and happily. I looked at my face in that photo and suddenly realized that for the first time in years, I felt echoes of that happiness and inner freedom. Not because I was trying to recreate the past, but because I was finally moving toward a future I had chosen for myself. 2 weeks after the incident at the restaurant, I received a formal letter from Carlos's lawyer. In dry legal language, it threatened to challenge my decisions, demanded a meeting to discuss a mutually acceptable solution, and hinted at the possibility of having my mental competency evaluated. This last suggestion was particularly offensive, a tactic commonly used against elderly people whose decisions don't please their relatives. I forwarded the letter to Mr. Peterson, who responded in equally formal terms, but with a clear indication that if legal proceedings were initiated, evidence of Carlos's assault would be presented, including witness statements and medical documentation of my injuries. A reply came 3 days later. The tone was much softer, and the threats of legal action had vanished. Instead, there was an offer to meet for family mediation and reconciliation. I declined, knowing this was just another attempt at manipulation. That same day, a massive bouquet of roses arrived with a box of expensive chocolates and a card signed by both Carlos and Sandra, with deepest apologies and hope for healing. I gave the flowers to my elderly neighbor and the chocolates to children playing in the apartment complex courtyard. No gifts could change my mind or undo what had been done. On Sunday, my doorbell rang. Carlos was standing on my doorstep, looking pale and tired, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. I almost closed the door immediately, but something in his expression, genuine remorse and pain, made me hesitate. "Mom," he said quietly, "please just listen to me for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes." I let him into my apartment but didn't invite him to sit down. We stood in the hallway, looking at each other like strangers. "I came to apologize," he began, his voice shaking. "What I did was unforgivable. I understand why you don't want to see me, why you changed your will. I deserved it all." "Yes, you did," I agreed. "But it wasn't just that slap, Carlos. It was the culmination of years of neglect, of letting Sandra manipulate our relationship, of treating me like a burden instead of your mother." Carlos lowered his eyes, unable to meet my gaze. "I know, and I have no excuse. But I want you to know that I realize my mistakes now. I've started seeing a therapist to work on my anger and control issues. I'm trying to change, Mom. I really am." "I'm glad to hear that," I said sincerely. "I hope it helps you become a better father to Miguel and Luis." "And a better son to you?" he asked hopefully. I looked at him for a long time, studying his face for any sign of the boy I had raised with such love and dedication. "Time will tell, Carlos," I said finally. "Right now, I'm not ready to resume our relationship. The trust has been broken, and trust takes time to rebuild." He nodded sadly but seemed to understand. "I know I hurt you terribly, not just physically but emotionally. 4 years. "Yes, you did," I replied. "And until you can stand up to Sandra, until you can be your own person instead of just echoing her opinions, nothing will really change." "She told me she talked to you at the cafe," he said quietly. "She told me what she said about the lies she told me that night." I was surprised. Sandra admitting to manipulation. That didn't sound like her. She did. I confronted her after I started therapy. My therapist helped me see how I've been letting other people control my emotions and actions. When I asked Sandra directly what she whispered to me that night, She finally told me the truth. And what did you think about that? Yes. I was horrified, he said, his voice breaking. To realize that she deliberately pushed my buttons, used my insecurities about Dad and Elena against both of us. I felt sick. What are you going to do about it? Asked, genuinely curious. Carlos was quiet for a long moment. I don't know yet. The therapist says I need to work on myself first before I can fix my relationships with other people, including my marriage. That sounds wise, I said. Carlos, I want you to know something. I never compared you to your father or to Elena. You were always enough exactly as you were. I was proud of your kindness, your work ethic, your dedication to your family. Sandra's lies were designed to hurt both of us. Tears started forming in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Mom. For everything. For believing her lies. For letting her isolate me from you. For hitting you. I don't know if I can ever make this right. The fact that you're here, taking responsibility, is a start, I said gently. But Carlos, you have to understand. I can't go back to the way things were. Too much has happened. Too much damage has been done. I understand, he whispered. I hope someday you might be able to forgive me. Not forget, but maybe forgive. I already forgive you, I said, surprising both of us. You're my son. I will always love you. But love doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior. Love sometimes means setting boundaries to protect yourself. Carlos nodded, wiping his eyes. Can I ask you about Miguel and Luis? They've been asking about you. How are they handling all of this? He asked, concerned. Luis especially has been upset. He keeps asking why you won't answer your phone, why we can't visit you anymore. Miguel pretends he doesn't care, but I can see he's affected too. I wrote them letters, I admitted. But I haven't sent them yet. I didn't want to make things worse. Maybe they could visit you sometime. Just them without Sandra and me. I would love that, I said, feeling my heart lift for the first time during this conversation. But would Sandra allow it? I'm working on that, Carlos said with more determination than I had heard from him in years. The therapist is helping me learn how to set boundaries too. He looked around my apartment, seeming to notice changes I had made. Elena's paintings on the walls, photography equipment organized in one corner. The photography school is really happening, he asked. Yes. I close on Elena's house next week. Renovations start the week after that. That's really great, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't support your dream before. Thank you for saying that. Can I ask you something? He said hesitantly. When you were my age, did you ever feel like you were living someone else's life instead of your own? The question surprised me with its insight. Sometimes, I admitted. Especially after your father died, I felt like I was just going through the motions, doing what was expected of me instead of what I truly wanted. That's how I've been feeling for years, he said quietly. Like I lost myself somewhere along the way. Like I became someone I don't even recognize. It's not too late to find yourself again, Carlos. You're only 43. You have time to become the person you want to be. Even if it means my marriage might not survive. Especially then, I said firmly. A marriage that requires you to lose yourself isn't worth saving. We talked for another few minutes, and for brief moments, I saw glimpses of the sensitive, thoughtful boy I had raised. When Carlos finally left, I felt emotionally drained but somehow hopeful. Not hopeful that we would immediately return to a close relationship, but hopeful that maybe, eventually, he might become the man I always believed he could be. 3 months later, I stood in the main room of what was now called Elena's light photography studio. The garage had been transformed beyond recognition. Skylights installed for natural lighting, professional-grade electrical systems, custom-built workstations for different types of photography equipment, and a small darkroom for students who wanted to learn traditional film development. Elena's landscape paintings hung on the walls, their vibrant colors inspiring creativity and wonder. The back room housed a gallery space where I displayed rotating selections of her work alongside photographs taken by my students. The grand opening had been more successful than I had dared to hope. Local families, teenagers, even some adults who wanted to learn photography as a hobby, all had signed up for classes. The local newspaper had written a feature article about the studio, calling it a much-needed addition to Meadowbrook's cultural landscape. I had hired 2 part-time instructors, Karen, a recent art school graduate who specialized in digital photography, and Bob, a retired professional photographer who taught traditional film techniques. But I still taught most of the classes myself, finding deep satisfaction in watching young people discover the joy of capturing moments and telling stories through images. Janet had become my unofficial business partner, handling administrative tasks and helping me navigate the challenges of running a small business. Margaret, the librarian from the downtown branch, organized monthly photography exhibitions where students could display their best work. The studio had become more than just a school. It was becoming a community gathering place, exactly as I had hoped. Standing there in the late afternoon light, watching a group of teenagers work on a portrait project, I felt a sense of accomplishment and purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just Elena's legacy or my tribute to Robert's memory. It was my own contribution to the world, my own creative expression. The doorbell at the front of the house interrupted my thoughts. I walked through the connecting hallway to answer it, expecting to see a parent picking up their child from class. Instead, I found Luis standing on my doorstep. He was taller now, almost as tall as his father, with the same serious eyes but a gentler expression. "Hi, Grandma," he said, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "I hope it's okay that I came by. Dad said you wouldn't mind." "Luis." I couldn't hide my joy and surprise. "Of course it's okay. Come in, please." He stepped inside and looked around with obvious curiosity. "This place is amazing. It's so different from what I expected. Would you like a tour?" he offered. "I'd love one." I showed him through the studio, explaining the different areas and equipment. He was particularly fascinated by the darkroom and asked thoughtful questions about the chemical processes involved in developing film. "Do you still have those old cameras you used to show us when we were little?" he asked. "Absolutely. They're in my office. Would you like to see them?" His face lit up with genuine interest, reminding me so much of Carlos at that age. We spent the next hour going through my collection of vintage cameras, and I told him the story behind each one. Luis listened intently, handling each camera with careful respect. "Grandma," he said as we finished looking at the cameras, "I need to tell you something. Dad has been different lately. Better, I think. He's been standing up to Mom more, making his own decisions." "How do you feel about that?" asked gently. "Relieved," he admitted. "For so long it felt like Mom controlled everything, what we did, where we went, who we could talk to. It was suffocating. And now Dad asks us what we want to do sometimes. He took us fishing last weekend without telling Mom first. She was angry, but he didn't back down." I felt a surge of pride for Carlos, mixed with concern for what this might mean for the family dynamics. "How is Miguel handling all the changes?" "He pretends he doesn't care, but I think he's happy too. He's been talking about maybe studying environmental science instead of business like Mom wanted." "What about you? What do you want to study?" "Photography," he said without hesitation. "I've been taking pictures with my phone, but I want to learn how to do it properly. With real cameras and film and everything." My heart nearly burst with joy and pride. "I would love to teach you, Luis. You could start with a basic class if you want." "Could I really? Would you want me to?" "Of course. You're my grandson. Teaching you photography would make me happier than you can imagine." "There's something else," he said, looking nervous again. "Dad wants to know if he could visit sometime. Not with Mom, just him. He says he understands if you say no, but he's hoping you might be willing to try." I thought about my conversation with Carlos 3 months earlier, about the changes Luis was describing. "Tell your father he can call me next week. We'll talk about it." "Really?" Luis's face brightened. "He'll be so happy." He's been miserable about what happened between you two. What about your mother? How does she feel about you being here? Luis's expression darkened slightly. She doesn't know. Dad said it was okay to visit you as long as I was careful about when and how. He's trying to protect Miguel and me from her anger. It saddened me that a 15-year-old boy had to sneak around to see his grandmother, but I was grateful that Carlos was finally showing some backbone in protecting his children from Sandra's manipulation. You're always welcome here, Luis. Anytime. And if you're serious about learning photography, I'd like to give you something. I went to my office and returned with one of my favorite cameras. A Canon film camera that Robert had given me for our 10th wedding anniversary. This was very special to your grandfather, I said, placing it gently in Luis's hands. He saved for months to buy it for me. I'd like you to have it. Luis stared at the camera with reverence, understanding its significance. Are you sure, Grandma? This must be worth a lot. It's worth more than money, sweetheart. It's worth memories and love and the continuation of creative traditions. I think your grandfather would be proud to know you're using his camera to create your own art. Tears filled Luis's eyes. Thank you. I'll take really good care of it. I know you will. And I'll teach you everything I know about using it. We spent another hour going over the camera's features, and I gave him several rolls of film to get started. As the sun began to set, Luis reluctantly said he had to go home. Thank you for today, Grandma. For the camera, for the tour, for not giving up on us. I could never give up on you and Miguel, I assured him. You're part of my heart, no matter what happens with your parents. After Luis left, I stood in my studio looking at Elena's paintings, thinking about the unexpected turns life had taken. A year and a half ago, I had been a lonely widow, trying to maintain relationships that were slowly destroying my sense of self-worth. Now I was a business owner, a teacher, a contributor to my community's cultural life. I had traded a toxic family dynamic for authentic relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests. The photography studio was thriving, my friendship with Janet had deepened, and I had begun to reconnect with Carlos and my grandsons on healthier terms. Most importantly, I had rediscovered my own identity and purpose. The physical blow that Carlos had given me that night at the restaurant had indeed been a turning point, but not in the way Sandra had intended. Instead of breaking me, it had freed me from the prison of other people's expectations and manipulations. It had given me the courage to choose my own path, to invest Elena's inheritance in something meaningful, to create a legacy that reflected my values rather than my family's demands. I thought about Sandra, wondering how she was handling Carlos's gradual transformation from puppet to independent person. From what Luis had told me, it wasn't going smoothly. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I had learned the hard lesson that you cannot save people from toxic relationships. They have to choose to save themselves. I could only control my own choices, my own boundaries, my own responses to difficult situations. As I turned off the studio lights and locked up for the evening, I felt grateful for the painful journey that had brought me to this point. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalysts for the best changes in our lives. Sometimes losing the family you thought you had leads to finding the family you actually need. Elena's light photography studio wasn't just a business or a memorial to my sister. It was a symbol of resilience, of creative renewal, of the possibility that it's never too late to start over and build something beautiful from the ashes of disappointment and betrayal. Walking back to my apartment, I looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace with my decisions and excited about my future. 6 months later, I received a call that changed everything once more. It was Carlos, and his voice sounded different, stronger, more confident than I had heard it in years. "Mom," he said, "I have some news. Sandra and I are getting divorced." I sat down in my favorite chair, processing this information. "How are you handling that, Carlos?" "Better than I expected," he replied. "The therapy has helped me realize that I've been living someone else's life for too long. I want to be the kind of person Miguel and Luis can be proud of, the kind of son you deserve." "You've always been the son I deserve," I said gently. You just lost your way for a while. Sandra fought the divorce at first, but when she realized I was serious about changing our family dynamic, she decided she'd rather start over with someone she could control more easily. And the boys? They're staying with me. Sandra was so focused on controlling our finances and social status that she never developed real emotional connections with them. They chose to live with me, and she didn't fight it much. I felt a mixture of sadness for Sandra's loneliness and joy for Carlos's liberation. What will you do now? I'm selling the big house and buying something smaller and more comfortable. I want the boys to have a normal teenage experience instead of constantly worrying about appearances and social expectations. That sounds wonderful, Carlos. There's something else, Mom. I've been thinking about what you said about finding myself again. I want to go back to photography. Not as a career necessarily, but as a creative outlet. I remember how much I loved it in high school before I got caught up in Sandra's ideas about success and status. My heart soared. I would love to help you rediscover that passion. Would you? Would you be willing to teach me? I know you have paying students, but maybe I could take some private lessons. Carlos, I said, my voice thick with emotion, I would be honored to teach you photography. We could start whenever you're ready. How about this weekend? The boys are excited about the idea too. Luis has been showing Miguel the pictures he's taken with Grandpa's camera. And now Miguel wants to learn too. For the first time in over a decade, I felt like I was getting my family back. Not the dysfunctional, controlled version Sandra had created, but a real family based on genuine love and mutual respect. I'll see you Saturday morning, I said. And Carlos, I'm proud of you for having the courage to change your life. I learned from the best, he replied. I learned from a woman who had the strength to walk away from toxicity and build something beautiful in its place. That Saturday morning, Carlos, Miguel, and Luis came to Elena's light photography studio for their first family lesson. As I watched my son handle a camera with the same gentle curiosity he had shown as a teenager, and saw my grandsons' faces light up as they discovered the magic of creating images, I realized that sometimes the most painful endings lead to the most beautiful new beginnings. Elena's paintings watched over us from the walls, seeming to approve of this gathering of 3 generations united by creativity and love. Robert's old camera was being passed between eager hands, continuing its journey through our family's story. And I, Rose Martinez, was exactly where I belonged, teaching, sharing, creating, and surrounded by people who chose to love me not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection and respect. The bruise on my cheek had long since healed, but it had left something far more valuable than a scar. It had left me with the knowledge that I was strong enough to demand respect, wise enough to recognize my worth, and brave enough to start over when necessary. As we worked together that morning, the studio filled with laughter and the excited chatter of discovery. Miguel captured a perfect close-up of a flower in Elena's garden. Luis experimented with different lighting angles for a portrait of his brother. Carlos rediscovered the joy of seeing the world through a viewfinder, freed from years of limiting himself to what others expected. I moved between them, offering gentle guidance and encouragement, feeling more like a grandmother and mother than I had in years. This was what family was supposed to feel like: supportive, creative, nurturing. No manipulation, no control, no walking on eggshells to avoid conflict. Just genuine connection and shared joy in learning something new together. During lunch break, we sat in Elena's garden, eating sandwiches and looking at the photos the boys had taken that morning. "Grandma," Miguel said, "I'm sorry we didn't visit you sooner. We wanted to, but..." "You don't need to apologize," I interrupted gently. "You were in a difficult situation. What matters is that we're here together now. Are you happy?" Luis asked me suddenly. "With your life, I mean. With the studio and everything." I looked around at my beautiful garden, my thriving business, and most importantly, at the 3 faces looking at me with love and genuine interest in my answer. "Yes, sweetheart," I said with complete honesty. "I'm happier than I've been in a very long time. Even though it was hard." Miguel asked, "Even though you had to make difficult decisions and cut people out of your life?" "Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the best outcomes," I replied. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I learned that it's never too late to follow your dreams. And I learned that real family isn't about blood relations. It's about people who choose to support and respect each other. Carlos reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out. You figured it out when you were ready, I said. That's what matters. As the afternoon wore on, we continued working with the cameras, and I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year and a half ago, Sandra's manipulation had caused Carlos to strike me in anger. It was one of the worst moments of my life, but it was also the beginning of the best chapter of my life. Sometimes blessings come disguised as disasters. Sometimes the people who try to destroy us accidentally set us free. Sometimes losing everything we thought we wanted helps us discover what we actually need. Elena's light photography studio had become more than a business or a memorial. It had become a symbol of resilience, transformation, and the power of choosing your own path regardless of others' expectations. As the sun began to set over Meadowbrook, casting golden light through the studio windows, I watched Carlos help Luis load film into Robert's old camera, while Miguel examined Elena's paintings with newfound appreciation for artistic expression. 3 generations, connected not by obligation or manipulation, but by genuine love, shared interests, and mutual respect. This was what I had been hoping for all those years when I endured Sandra's controlling behavior. Real relationships with my son and grandsons. But I had learned that sometimes you have to lose what you think you want in order to get what you actually need. Sometimes you have to walk away from toxic situations before healthy relationships can grow in their place. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their harmful behavior and start modeling what healthy boundaries look like. The story that began with a slap across my face in a crowded restaurant had ended with laughter and learning in a photography studio filled with light, creativity, and authentic family love. As Carlos, Miguel, and Luis prepared to leave that evening, each carrying a roll of film to develop during the week, I felt a deep sense of completion and gratitude. Not completion in the sense that the story was over. There would be many more family photography sessions, many more opportunities to build and strengthen these renewed relationships. But completion in the sense that I had successfully transformed the worst experience of my later life into something beautiful and meaningful. Same time next week. Carlos asked as they gathered their things. I'll be here, I promised. With new projects and new techniques to share. Thank you, Mom, he said, hugging me goodbye. For everything. For not giving up on us. For showing us what courage looks like. For building something so beautiful out of something so painful. Thank you for being willing to change and grow, I replied. For choosing to be the man your sons can admire and the son I always knew you could be. After they left, I stood in my studio surrounded by Elena's paintings, Robert's memory, and the evidence of a day well spent teaching the people I loved most. The woman who had been knocked to a restaurant floor 18 months ago felt like a completely different person from who I was now. Stronger, more independent, clearer about my values and boundaries, and surrounded by relationships based on choice rather than obligation. Elena's inheritance had given me the financial means to start over, but the courage to use it had come from within. The photography studio was thriving, my friendship with Janet had deepened into something like sisterhood, and my relationship with Carlos and the boys was healthier than it had ever been. Most importantly, I had rediscovered Rose Martinez. Not just as someone's mother or grandmother, but as an individual with her own dreams, talents, and contributions to make to the world. As I turned off the studio lights and locked the door, I thought about Sandra, wondering if she was happy in her new life, if she had learned anything from the dissolution of her marriage, if she would ever understand the damage her controlling behavior had caused. But those questions were no longer my concern. I had learned that you cannot change other people. You can only change how you respond to them. And my response had been to remove myself from a toxic situation and build something positive in its place. Walking back to my apartment under a sky full of stars, I felt grateful for every step of the difficult journey that had brought me to this point of peace and purpose. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalysts for the most important changes in our lives. The next morning I woke up early and made myself coffee, looking forward to another day at the studio. I had a full schedule, a portrait class for adults, a nature photography workshop for teenagers, and a meeting with the mayor about including Elena's light in the town's official arts program. As I got dressed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and was struck by how different I looked from 18 months ago. Not just older but more confident, more at peace with myself. There was a strength in my expression that hadn't been there before, a clarity in my eyes that spoke of someone who had been tested and emerged stronger. My cheek, which had once borne the mark of Carlos's anger, now showed only the natural lines of a woman who had learned to smile again. The phone rang, interrupting my morning routine. It was Janet, calling to confirm our lunch plans and to share news about a grant opportunity that could help expand the studio's educational programs. "Good morning, partner," she said cheerfully. "Ready for another day of changing young people's lives through the magic of photography?" "Always ready," I laughed. "Have I told you lately how grateful I am for your friendship and support?" "Only about 100 times," Janet replied warmly. "But feel free to keep saying it. At our age, we need all the positive affirmations we can get." As I walked to the studio that morning, I passed the restaurant where everything had changed that terrible night 18 months ago. For a moment, I paused and looked through the windows, remembering the humiliation and shock of that evening. But instead of pain, I felt something like gratitude. That slap, as awful as it had been the wake-up call I needed to stop accepting unacceptable treatment and start building the life I actually wanted. Elena's light photography studio was already bustling with activity when I arrived. Early students were setting up equipment, examining yesterday's developed photographs, and chatting excitedly about their projects. The walls were covered with student work, portraits, landscapes, abstract compositions, and experimental pieces that showed real creativity and growth. This was my legacy, I realized. Not just the money I might leave behind or the family connections I maintained, but the knowledge and passion I passed on to others, the creativity I encouraged, the confidence I helped young people build in themselves. Every student who learned to see the world differently through a camera lens, every teenager who discovered they had artistic talent, every adult who found a new hobby that brought them joy, they were all part of what Elena's inheritance had made possible. As the day progressed, filled with teaching and learning and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work, I found myself thinking about the different ways people can choose to respond to life's challenges. Sandra had chosen manipulation and control, trying to force the world to bend to her will. Carlos had initially chosen passivity, allowing others to make decisions for him rather than taking responsibility for his own life. But ultimately, we had all been given opportunities to grow and change. Sandra had chosen to double down on her toxic behavior and had lost her family as a result. Carlos had chosen to do the hard work of therapy and self-examination, and had reclaimed his authenticity and his relationships. And I had chosen to stop accepting unacceptable treatment, to invest in my own dreams rather than sacrificing them for others' approval, and to build something positive out of a painful situation. The afternoon flew by in a blur of creative instruction and encouraging feedback. As closing time approached, I was pleasantly surprised to see Luis appear in the doorway, camera bag slung over his shoulder and a shy smile on his face. "Hi, Grandma. Is it okay if I stay for a while? I have some new photos I'd love to show you." "Of course, sweetheart. I always have time for you." We spent the next hour in the darkroom, developing his latest roll of film. As image after image appeared in the developing solution, I was amazed by his progress and natural talent. He had captured a series of photographs documenting life in Meadowbrook, children playing in the park, elderly couples sitting on benches, vendors at the farmer's market, teenagers hanging out by the lake. "These are remarkable, Luis," I said, genuinely impressed. "You have a real gift for capturing authentic human moments." "Thank you. I've been thinking about maybe applying to art school after high school, specializing in documentary photography." "That sounds like a wonderful plan. Have you talked to your father about it?" "Yes, and he's supportive. He said he wants Miguel and me to follow our passions instead of just doing what's expected of us." As we hung the photographs to dry, Luis asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Grandma, do you ever regret what happened? With Dad hitting you and everything that came after?" I considered his question carefully. I regret that it happened, I said finally. I regret that our family went through such a painful period. But I don't regret the changes that came from it. What do you mean? He asked. I mean that sometimes terrible events force us to make changes we should have made long ago. If your father hadn't hit me that night, I might have continued accepting disrespectful treatment indefinitely. I might never have found the courage to pursue my own dreams or demand better relationships. Luis nodded thoughtfully. It's like in photography, isn't it? Sometimes you have to adjust the exposure or change the lighting completely to get the picture you really want. That's a beautiful analogy, I said, marveling at his insight. Yes, it's exactly like that. Sometimes life requires dramatic adjustments before the real picture becomes clear. As we finished up in the darkroom, Luis helped me clean and organize equipment for the next day's classes. Working alongside him, watching his careful attention to detail and his genuine love for the craft, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what Elena's money had truly bought. Not just a building or equipment, but relationships, opportunities, growth, and the chance to pass on knowledge and passion to the next generation. When Luis finally left that evening, promising to show his father and brother the new photographs, I walked through my studio one more time before locking up. Elena's paintings seemed to glow in the evening light, their vibrant colors a testament to a life lived with creative courage and independence. Robert's memory lived on in every camera I used to teach, every technique I demonstrated, every student who learned to see beauty through a viewfinder. And my own story. The story of a woman who refused to accept less than she deserved, who turned a moment of violence into a catalyst for transformation, who chose to build something beautiful rather than remain trapped in bitterness, was being written every day through the success of Elena's light photography studio. As I drove home that evening, I realized that the title of my story had changed completely from 18 months ago. It was no longer, "My son punched me in the face after his wife talked to him," a story of betrayal, manipulation, and family dysfunction. Now it was "How I Built a New Life from the Ashes of Old Pain," a story of resilience, creative fulfillment, and authentic relationships. The physical blow that had knocked me to the floor of that restaurant had ultimately been the push I needed to stand up for myself, to stop accepting the unacceptable, and to start living as the strong, independent, creative woman I had always been beneath years of trying to please others. And perhaps most importantly, it had shown Carlos and my grandsons what it looked like to have boundaries, to demand respect, and to choose your own path regardless of others' expectations. In losing one version of my family, I had gained something far more valuable. A family based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine love rather than obligation and manipulation. That night, as I sat on my small balcony looking out at the lights of Meadowbrook reflected in the lake, I thought about Elena and how proud she would be of what her inheritance had created. Not just the photography studio, but the transformation of our entire family dynamic. Her final gift hadn't just been money. It had been the opportunity for all of us to discover who we really were when freed from toxic expectations and manipulative control. I thought about Robert too, and how he would have handled the situation with Carlos and Sandra. I knew he would have been proud of my courage in walking away from abuse, proud of my determination to build something positive from pain, and especially proud of the way I had chosen to invest Elena's legacy in education and creativity rather than personal luxury. The gentle evening breeze carried the scent of the lake and the distant sound of teenagers laughing as they walked along the waterfront. This was the community I had chosen to serve, the place where Elena's light photography studio was making a small but meaningful difference in young people's lives. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to teach and learn and grow. But tonight, I was content to sit quietly and appreciate how far I had come from that terrible evening 18 months ago when I had been knocked to the floor of an expensive restaurant, humiliated and heartbroken. The woman who had fallen that night had been someone who accepted disrespect in order to maintain the illusion of family unity. The woman sitting on this balcony was someone who had learned that real unity could only exist where there was mutual respect, that real love didn't require sacrificing your dignity, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable destructive behavior. As the weeks and months continued to pass, Elena's light photography studio grew from a small community school into something approaching a local institution. We added evening classes for adults, weekend workshops for families, and a summer camp program that introduced dozens of children to the joy of creative expression through photography. The gallery space showcased not only Elena's landscapes but rotating exhibitions of student work, local artists, and traveling shows that brought culture and inspiration to Meadowbrook. Carlos continued his photography lessons and gradually began to rediscover the artistic sensibility that Sandra's emphasis on material success had nearly extinguished. Miguel, inspired by his brother's passion, developed an interest in environmental photography and began documenting local wildlife and natural habitats around the lake. Luis advanced quickly from basic camera operation to sophisticated composition and darkroom techniques, and was already building a portfolio for college applications. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the way our family relationships had evolved from obligation-based interactions to choice-based connections. When we spent time together now, it was because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, not because social expectations demanded it. Our conversations were honest and open, free from the walking on eggshells atmosphere that had characterized family gatherings during Sandra's reign of control. One afternoon in late spring, almost 2 years after the restaurant incident, I was teaching a portrait class when my phone buzzed with an unexpected text message. It was from Miguel. "Grandma, would it be okay if I brought a friend to the studio tomorrow? She's interested in photography and wants to see your equipment." I smiled, remembering how formal and distant my grandsons had been during Sandra's manipulative years. Now they felt comfortable enough to suggest bringing friends to meet me, to share their enthusiasm for photography with their peers. "Of course," I texted back. "Any friend of yours is welcome here." That evening, Carlos called to thank me for being so welcoming to the boys' friends and social activities. "It means a lot to them to have a grandmother who's interested in their lives and supportive of their hobbies," he said. I realize now how much Sandra's controlling behavior isolated them from normal teenage experiences. "How are you adjusting to single parenthood?" "Yes. Better than I expected," he replied. "It's challenging, but it's also liberating to make decisions based on what's actually best for the boys instead of what looks good to Sandra's social circle." "And how is Sandra doing?" I asked, genuinely curious about my former daughter-in-law's adjustment to her new circumstances. "According to mutual friends, she's already dating someone new. Another lawyer from her firm, someone she can probably mold into the kind of partner she wants. I wish her well, but I'm grateful to be out of that relationship." "Do you regret the years you spent married to her?" Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "I regret the way I let her manipulation damage my relationship with you. I regret the way I failed to protect Miguel and Luis from her controlling behavior. But I don't regret the marriage entirely, because it gave me my sons, and it also taught me some hard but important lessons about standing up for myself and the people I love." "Those are valuable lessons," I agreed. "Even if they came at a high price. The price was worth it if it means Miguel and Luis grow up knowing how to recognize and resist manipulation, how to maintain their independence while still valuing family relationships." As we talked, I reflected on how much Carlos had matured over the past 2 years. The angry, defensive man who had struck me in that restaurant had been replaced by someone thoughtful, self-aware, and genuinely committed to being a better father and son. "Mom," Carlos said as our conversation was winding down, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you built with Elena's inheritance. The photography studio isn't just a business. It's a real contribution to the community. You've given young people opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot coming from you. I also want you to know that I'm proud to be your son. Not because of what you do for me or give to me, but because of who you are, your strength, your creativity, your refusal to accept less than you deserve. You've shown all of us what it looks like to live with integrity and purpose." His words brought tears to my eyes. For so many years during his marriage to Sandra, I had wondered if I had failed as a mother, if I had somehow not given him the tools he needed to resist manipulation and maintain his independence. Now I understood that he had always had those tools. He had just temporarily forgotten how to use them under the pressure of Sandra's emotional control. The next day, Miguel arrived at the studio with his friend Sarah, a quiet girl with intelligent eyes and an obvious fascination with the technical aspects of photography. As I showed them around the darkroom and explained the chemical processes involved in film development, I was struck by their genuine curiosity and enthusiasm. These were the moments that made all the challenges of starting Elena's light photography studio worthwhile. Seeing young people discover new passions, watching their confidence grow as they mastered new skills, knowing that I was helping to shape the next generation of artists and creators. After Sarah and Miguel left, promising to return for a weekend workshop, I spent some time alone in the gallery, looking at Elena's paintings and thinking about the unexpected journey that had brought me to this point. 2 years ago, I had been a lonely widow clinging to toxic family relationships out of fear of being alone. Now I was a successful business owner, respected teacher, and beloved grandmother, surrounded by people who chose to be in my life because they valued what I had to offer, not because they wanted something from me. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been lonely nights, difficult decisions, moments of doubt and regret. But every step of the journey had been worth it to reach this point of peace, purpose, and authentic connection with the people who mattered most. As I prepared to close the studio for the day, Luis arrived for his regularly scheduled practice session. He was now skilled enough to work independently, developing his own artistic vision and personal style. "Grandma," he said as he set up his equipment, "I've been thinking about something. Do you think you could teach me how to take the kind of portraits that really capture people's personalities? Not just what they look like, but who they really are." "That's one of the most challenging aspects of photography," I replied, pleased by his ambition. "But yes, I can teach you some techniques. The most important thing is learning to make your subjects comfortable, to help them forget about the camera and just be themselves. Could we start with family portraits? I'd like to take some pictures of you and Dad and Miguel. Real pictures that show our relationships, not just posed shots." "I'd love that," I said, thinking about how different these family portraits would be from the stiff, formal photographs Sandra had insisted on during holidays and special occasions. Luis's images would capture genuine emotion, real connections, the kind of authentic family love that had emerged from the ashes of our former dysfunction. As we worked together that afternoon, I was struck once again by how much healing had occurred in our family over the past 2 years. Not just forgiveness for past hurts, but actual growth, positive change, and the development of healthier patterns of relating to each other. The physical blow that had knocked me to the restaurant floor had indeed been a turning point, but not in the way Sandra had intended. Instead of breaking me, it had freed me. Instead of giving them control over Elena's inheritance, it had given me the courage to use that inheritance for something meaningful. Instead of keeping our family trapped in toxic patterns, it had forced all of us to confront the truth about our relationships and make conscious choices about how we wanted to move forward. That evening, as I walked home from the studio, I passed the site where a new community center was being built. The town council had asked Elena's light photography studio to provide educational programming for the center when it opened next year, recognition of how successfully we had served Meadowbrook's cultural and educational needs. The shy, lonely widow who had been intimidated by Sandra's social connections and manipulative behavior would never have imagined that she could become a respected community leader, sought after for her expertise and valued for her contributions. But transformation, I had learned, was always possible when you had the courage to leave behind what wasn't working and build something better in its place. The story that had begun with violence and betrayal had become a story of resilience, creativity, and the power of choosing your own path regardless of others' expectations. As I reached my apartment building, I looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky and felt grateful for every painful step of the journey that had brought me to this point of peace and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new students to teach, new photographs to develop, new opportunities to make a positive difference in young people's lives. And Carlos would be stopping by with the boys for our weekly family photography session, where we would continue building the kind of authentic relationships that should have existed all along. The bruise on my cheek had long since healed, leaving no visible scar. But the invisible scar it had left, the knowledge that I was strong enough to demand respect, wise enough to recognize manipulation, and brave enough to start over when necessary, would remain with me forever, a reminder that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalysts for the most important changes in our lives. Elena's light photography studio stood as proof that inheritance could be about more than money, that legacy could be about more than blood relationships, and that it was never too late to discover who you really were when freed from the expectations and limitations imposed by others. The woman who had been knocked down in that restaurant 2 years ago had gotten back up stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live life on her own terms. And in doing so, she had shown her son and grandsons that it was possible to break free from toxic patterns, to choose healthy relationships over dysfunctional ones, and to create something beautiful from the ashes of disappointment and betrayal. The title of my story had changed completely. From a tale of family dysfunction and emotional abuse to a testament of resilience, creative fulfillment, and the transformative power of refusing to accept less than you deserve. And as I settled into my comfortable chair that evening with a cup of tea and Elena's latest landscape painting glowing softly in the lamplight, I knew with certainty that every painful step of the journey had been worth it to reach this destination of peace, purpose, and authentic love. Sometimes the most devastating blows life delivers become the very forces that set us free to become who we were always meant to be. And sometimes losing the family you thought you had is the only way to find the family you actually need. 6 months later, on a sunny Saturday morning in autumn, Elena's Light Photography Studio hosted its second annual student exhibition. The gallery was filled with families, friends, and community members admiring the work of photographers ranging in age from 8 to 80. Carlos, Miguel, and Luis had a special display showcasing their family portrait project. Intimate, honest images that captured the genuine love and respect that now characterized our relationships. As I moved through the crowded gallery, accepting congratulations and watching young artists proudly explain their work to interested viewers, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that terrible night at the restaurant. The scared, lonely woman who had accepted emotional abuse in order to maintain the illusion of family unity had been replaced by someone confident, creative, and surrounded by people who valued her for who she truly was rather than what she could provide for them. Elena's paintings, displayed prominently throughout the gallery, seemed to approve of the celebration of creativity and artistic expression that her inheritance had made possible. Robert's memory lived on in every student who learned to see beauty through a camera lens, every technique I demonstrated, every moment of wonder when a young person captured their first perfect photograph. Near the end of the exhibition, Luis approached me with a special photograph he had been working on in secret. It was a portrait of me in the studio, surrounded by cameras and artwork, with a look of deep contentment and purpose on my face. "I wanted to capture what happiness looks like," he said, presenting me with a carefully matted and framed image. Not fake happiness or polite happiness, but real happiness that comes from doing what you love and being with people who love you back. Looking at his photograph, I saw myself through his eyes, not as an aging woman who had been discarded by her family, but as someone who had found her true calling and built meaningful relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The woman in Luis's photograph had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger, wiser, and more purposeful than ever before. "This is beautiful," I said, genuinely moved by his artistic vision and technical skill. "But more than that, it's true. This is exactly how I feel. Truly happy for the first time in many years." "Good," Luis smiled. "Because you deserve to be happy, Grandma. After everything you've been through, after all the ways you've helped our family heal and grow, you deserve to have a life that brings you joy." As the exhibition wound down and the last visitors departed, Carlos, Miguel, Luis, and I spent a few quiet moments together in the gallery, surrounded by the evidence of how far we had all come since that painful night that had changed everything. "Mom," Carlos said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that hitting you was the worst thing I've ever done, but what came after, your courage in walking away, your determination to build something positive, the way you showed us all what real strength looks like, that was the best thing that could have happened to our family." "It wasn't easy," I replied, "for any of us. But sometimes the most difficult experiences teach us the most important lessons." "What lesson did you learn?" Miguel asked. "I learned that I'm strong enough to demand respect, creative enough to build something meaningful from scratch, and worthy of relationships based on genuine love rather than obligation or manipulation. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to start over and become who you were always meant to be." As we locked up the studio that evening and prepared to go home, Carlos and the boys to their cozy house by the lake, and me to my comfortable apartment filled with Elena's paintings and Robert's memory. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the painful journey that had brought us all to this point of healing and authentic connection. The story that had begun with a slap across my face in a crowded restaurant had become a testament to the transformative power of refusing to accept less than you deserve, the importance of choosing healthy relationships over toxic ones, and the amazing things that become possible when you have the courage to start over, regardless of your age or circumstances. Elena's light photography studio would continue to serve our community for years to come, teaching new generations of young people to see beauty in the world around them and express their creativity through the art of photography. But its greatest success wasn't measured in enrollment numbers or community recognition. It was measured in the healing it had brought to our family, the authentic relationships it had made possible, and the proof it provided that even the most devastating betrayals can become the foundation for something beautiful and meaningful. And as I settled into bed that night, surrounded by the peace and contentment that comes from living authentically and being loved genuinely, I knew with absolute certainty that every painful step of the journey had been worth it to reach this destination of true happiness, creative fulfillment, and family love based on choice rather than obligation. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the doorways to our best chapters, and sometimes losing everything we thought we wanted is the only way to discover what we actually need. The end.